If you're looking for a really good server installation that's going to help to reduce your attack surface by running minimal amounts of services, ServerCore is probably what you're looking for. When we talk about ServerCore, ServerCore is an installation of server that does not have a GUI. So it's going to be managed by the command line, PowerShell, and also through the RStat tool that we're going to talk about in just a moment. So if you want to work with ServerCore, you can actually install a lot of roles on it, things like directory services. You can install DNS, DHCP, Hyper-V, certificate services, and there's quite a large list of things that it will install, but there's also a number of services and roles that it cannot install, and that is to help us reduce the attack surface. When we talk about working with ServerCore, we're going to see that you're going to need to manage it, if you'd like, as one option, through the Remote Server Administration tool, also known as RStat. Now, RStat can actually be loaded on a client system running Windows 8.1 or later. And if you'd like to download that from Microsoft's website, you can then go ahead and move into adding it into Server Manager. So you download, run the executable, add it to Server Manager. And then after you do that, you are going to need to go into Server Manager to be able to connect to the remote server. After you've connected to the remote server, you can then install the Active Directory role if you'd like, just like we did earlier by adding the files. Then you can go in and you can add in the configuration options through the Configuration Wizard and configure your domain controller. You could also, if you'd like, run it through PowerShell. Now, the options that you're seeing here are actually options that we could have used a little bit earlier to install a domain controller, but it works out really well too if we're going to be using the command line environment that ServerCore offers us. So you could use PowerShell here, and you could run the install-Windows feature, and you could add in the domain service using some of the commands that we see here. That will simply add the files for us. Then you can go in and you can install and configure the domain controller with our Install ADDS domain controller option. So a lot of ways to do management if you'd like. Command line GUI, your choice. ServerCore could be a good choice for us too to reduce our attack surface. Another really good option to get a domain controller running in Windows 2016 is to use two different upgrade options. You could do an in-place upgrade if you'd like. I could take a system that's running Windows Server 2008 and I can upgrade it into 2016. And I can do that very easily. And if I decide to go that route, the big benefit there is that I don't need additional hardware to make that happen. The other benefit is I can keep all the files that I currently have in place. So there's going to be very little setting change when you do an in-place upgrade. The risk with it, though, could be very large. And the risk here is essentially the fact that if the upgrade does not go right, I may not have a way to roll back. So if you're going to do an in-place upgrade, it's best to actually do a backup before, and that way if something doesn't work out properly for you, you can have a plan B to be able to roll this back so that you have an operational domain controller. But the in-place upgrade, a lot of people like to use it. Just be aware of the risk involved with it. You could also do a clean install. This is actually the preferred method. The issue with this, though, is that you may not have additional hardware in order to install Windows 2016 on. You might just have the one domain controller that you're working with and you got to upgrade that. But if you do have the additional hardware, it's worthwhile to do a clean installation because then you don't have remnants of some of the old files hanging out and settings that you have to configure. But the big benefit here is that it's a clean installation and there's a lot of less ends to kind of tie up with it. So you have two options to do an upgrade for your domain controller, in place or clean installation. If you decide to do the in-place upgrade, what you're going to want to do first is check your hardware and software and make certain that it's compatible with 2016. So if it's not compatible, then that's going to stop you right there, and maybe you have to do a clean install and get better server hardware before you do your new installation of a domain controller. So you want to check hardware and software first, making certain that's compatible. Then you want to go ahead and run your setup. So it's, you're installing the system, you're putting your CD in, and you're running your setup to do the installation of 2016. After you do that, you are going to go through and make certain that you install the Windows and keep the files. So if you choose the option to do an in-place upgrade, it will keep all the files in place. And after that, you can then decide if you like to turn it into a domain controller. So you can kind of see some of those options there. If you decide to do a clean installation, that could be another route, and again, it's the preferred route if you have the hardware. You're going to deploy this system with 2016 on it. After you deploy it, you're going to want to configure it so that it's set to go as an operating system. And then you're going to kind of follow the same process that we've talked about earlier, where you're going to want to join it to the domain. and then promote it to be a domain controller by adding in the role, by adding the files first and then running the configuration for the domain controller. So the clean installation could be a really good option. Yet another way to install a domain controller is by using IFM, or Install from Media. If you decide to go this installation route, this is actually a really good one when it comes to security and also when you have a very slow, unreliable line. How IFM works is if I'm going to have a remote location that I'd like to install a domain controller on, I can either push the Active Directory database and the sysvol files across that slow WAN link, costly WAN link, or what I can do is I can install it from media. This is a very good option to take a closer look at, and especially if I have an unsecure WAN connection and I don't really want to push the Active Directory database and the sysvol across that unsecure network, this could be a very good option for you. So IFM, Install from Media, for installing domain controllers at maybe a branch office, also for helping us to get the domain controller up and running as quickly as possible. If you'd like to use Install from Media, what you can do is you can run a couple different deployment methods. The one that we recommend is using ntdsutil. This is a command line utility that you can use to back up Active Directory. So you're going to want to go to a domain controller and back it up using the ntdsutil. After you do that, you are going to want to take that backed up Active Directory file that's on maybe a media stick, and you're going to want to take it over to the remote location. So you're going to mail it to them or send it to them, however you like to do that. Once they get it, what they're going to do is they're going to run through the process of doing the installation of Active Directory. And so they're going to go into Server Manager, and they are going to go ahead and run the process of installing Active Directory, which we'll see in just a moment. Some of the benefits here is that we're going to be able to locally execute this file. So again, rather than pushing it across the WAN link, maybe the very large Active Directory database and the very large sysvol file. And we're going to note too that once that domain controller is up and running, it's going to be able then to replicate the changes with other domain controllers that are out there. So it's kind of a win-win all around, especially if you have a very large database and an insecure network. Here's what it might look like. Notice we're walking through the process of installing and configuring the Active Directory option. So notice we have the configuration wizard open, and under additional options is where you get the option to install the media. So you've gone through and you've installed the Active Directory role, added those files, and then step 2, you're running the configuration wizard. So at the additional options page is where you can choose Install from Media, and simply put in the path to wherever your media is located. And then from there, you can say which domain controller you'd like to replicate from. And you can choose to replicate from any domain controller, or maybe you have a preferred domain controller to replicate from that's local to where you're at. As you can see, there's a lot of ways to install a domain controller. And your big driver in all of this is going to be security. So if you decide to go with Server Core, remember there's a lot of roles that you can add to it, but there's also some roles and services that you can't. So if you want to reduce your attack surface, Server Core is the way to go. Another option though, of course, if you remember, was upgrading your domain controller. And a lot of ways to do that, in place or clean installation. It really depends on whether you have extra hardware lying around or not. You can also use IMF. It's an easy way for you to be able to install a domain controller at a remote location without compromising security. So think about how you might want to do this and be able to maximize security.